program, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Michelle's big binder might have something. If not, I would have no idea. Hello, my name is Eric Cross, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program. Presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know your feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. To view past programs, please visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We'd like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help us keep programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you are interested. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able to and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rich Barbuto. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. 12 years ago, Mark Hull was on a deployment to Iraq where he was involved in military intelligence operations. A year later, I was involved in the hiring process that brought Mark to the Command and General Staff College. Professor Hull has been a stellar member of the department, both as an instructor and one who continues to publish scholarly books and articles. He teaches both criminal law and military history, and his students love him. Professor Hull earned his doctorate from the University College of Cork in Ireland and his Juris Doctor from the Cumberland School of Law. He's also an elected fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a singular honor. And now Professor Hull is a student again. He was just admitted into the Doctor of Law program at the Friedrich Alexander Universität in Nuremberg, Germany, to study the subject of speech as genocide. Mark is a master of multiple genres: military intelligence, Irish history, German history, law enforcement, and war crimes. He combines these genres into articles and presentations that please both the scholarly and general audiences. For example, his books include Irish Secrets, German Espionage in Wartime Ireland, and Masquerade, Treason, Holocaust Denial, and an Irish Imposter. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Mark Hull.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon. Let me start this. I hadn't planned to do this at all, but I'm going to tell you a story about Rich Barbuto. Back when I got back from Iraq, was having a little bit of difficulty, and I learned about the job opening at the Department of Military History, so I did a phone interview with them. And it didn't really go in a great direction. And they were asking me questions, and it's never a good sign when you have to ask somebody what their question means. And I didn't get the job, and then I came down later to have a talk with Rich, and we sat down on the food court in our building, and I was going over what had happened, and he says, well, I tell you what we're going to do. He says, when we get finished with lunch, we're going to go to the bookstore over here, and you're going to buy some books, and you're going to read them, so the next time you interview, you won't sound stupid. And I did, and it worked out just fine. So, I mean, I owe Rich more than I can ever possibly repay, and I wouldn't be here today, and I wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the cool stuff they've given me the freedom to do, but for Rich's kindness. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. Well, it's a good question. Yeah, amazingly, none of them were written by Rich at the time, so yeah. I will start out with one thing, and I'll get to you here in a second with what I would like to focus on today. And let's start with this first slide. It's probably helpful to remember that for today's purposes, that W's are V's and V's are F's. W's are V's and V's are F's. So the subject of our talk today is General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. See, so when you leave, even if the rest of your time you don't feel like is well spent, you can leave with that. And a little bit about me, which is I'm not he, but I'll do the best I can for you. And Rich has already covered most of this. So let's start out with a travel recommendation. So if you're in Germany and you go there, and I recommend it highly, and I go as often as I can you go to a city called Sarre-Louis on the French-German border. And if you know where to go inside Sarre-Louis, you can go to a house, and the house has a plaque, and the plaque identifies it as the birthplace of General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. But I'm not going to ask you to go to Sarre-Louis just for that, because you can get a 2-for-1 there. Because if most people, I don't think, maybe nobody knows this. Because in the same city, just a couple of streets over, you can find another plaque with another person, Marshal Ney, who was one of Napoleon's chief commanders. The Sarre-Louis Tourist Board asked me to tell you that, but so now we can move along. I'm going to focus today on a couple of different things. One of them is something in the Army that we call an economy of force operation. And by that I mean it's a mission that doesn't require the predominant strength that you bring, but rather a portion of it. And we're going to talk about the concept of attrition. And more importantly than that, I want to focus on the idea that sometimes small things can have an outsized effect. And lastly, and I may struggle to get all this in here, I want to talk about how the East Africa Campaign and General Vorbeck have been considered and thought of throughout history and how that changes, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It's not a straightforward narrative, and if it was, you could just go to the Wikipedia page on his listing and learn everything you need to know. And it's more interesting and better and more complicated than that, and I'll touch on that here in a little bit. I'm going to pass out now 3 show and tell things that I brought for you. I will get back to these later, but as they come around, on the 2 books, I've marked parts of them, and if you go ahead and turn to those pages, you can see what's on there. And the third thing is an artifact from German East Africa from the war. It's some currency that was issued. And we'll talk more about that too. Thank you. All right, the subject of our talk, General Lettow-Vorbeck, is born in 1870. He dies fairly recently in 1964, so I mean he lives a good long time. His family is from Pomerania. He comes from a military family. And in a German sense, that means a great deal. I've had an old friend of mine who died last year, whose family had produced officers for the Prussian army since before there was really a Prussia. So going back to the 17th century, every generation in this family had produced officers for the army for 300 years. And that's the family business. And that's the same thing, too, with Lettow-Vorbeck. And I think that there are qualities that come along with that are hard to explain unless you deep dive on them a little bit. But it's this tradition of very much service in a particular sort of a way. So he's born in Sarre-Louis, where his father is stationed. He goes through the Prussian cadet system. He goes to the Prussian cadet Academy at Gross-Lichterfelde. He comes into the Army, and through the early part of his career, he has basically regular assignments. But in 1900, he's posted to the German contingent that goes into the Boxer Rebellion. So it's his first major overseas posting. He didn't care for it, but he did it. He comes back, and then in 1905, he's posted to German Southwest Africa, which is one of these German colonies that they pick up really from the 1880s forward. The Germans get into the colonial business a little bit late, so all the best parts have been spoken for the most part. And weirdly, the armed forces that are assigned to these colonies, if you join that group, you leave the direct control of the German army, and you now go to work for the colonial office. So in the case, and you join an organization called the Schutztruppe. It's the protective force of German military that are assigned to the different colonies. So in 1905, when he goes to German Southwest Africa, he's detached from direct German army service, and he effectively works for the governor of the colony, the colonial office, and then back to the Kaiser. The German Southwest Africa campaign is controversial for a lot of different reasons. There's a rebellion there among the Herero tribes, and Lettow-Vorbeck is wounded. He's evacuated to a hospital in South Africa, the British colony, and he misses, thankfully, the end of the campaign, which involved a German commander named Lothar von Trotha, who issues an order to exterminate the Herero tribesmen, all of them. And it's that even in 2019, that's still an ongoing mission, because the Namibians, who live in what used to be Southwest Africa, are still looking for official recognition that this was probably the first genocide of the modern period. And it's, as of a couple of weeks ago, there was another story about that. But in the case of Lettow-Vorbeck, what it enables him to do is, between China and Southwest Africa, he's getting outside the experience that most German officers are going to have. So he's put into situations where he's dealing with people from other cultures and other languages. He's working with Germans overseas, but more importantly, he's working with indigenous people overseas. So in 1914, in April, he is assigned to go to the German colony in Cameroon, except at the last minute his orders get changed and he ends up getting rerouted to German East Africa, what's today Tanzania, so right adjacent to the British colony in East Africa. He's there, again, as of April 1914. The war begins on the first week of August 1914. So barely has he had a time to get his feet wet to figure out who he's working with and where he's working before the war starts. And once that occurs, the governor of the colony, his name is Schnee, his intention is to have the colony declared neutral, provided that they don't create a problem for the British. But Lettow-Vorbeck disagrees, and in fact, he forces the governor into a situation where he has decided that he will not do that, that in fact he will defend the colony, and he's going to do more than just defend the colony. The war in Africa is complex. It involves different theaters, but in short, it's a question of a handful, and I'm talking about a tiny handful, of German professional soldiers, a handful of officers, a handful of NCOs, and mostly native troops called askaris, who work for the Germans, to defend a colony that is quite considerably large against a force they cannot possibly defeat. But in a weird sense, they kind of do exactly that. And it depends on how you want to define victory. They don't win the war. They're not capable of winning the war. But they managed to do something that almost no other force, at least in the modern period, has had against these sort of numbers. They fight the British to a draw. And that wasn't supposed to happen. The British didn't anticipate it. The British allies didn't anticipate it. This is Lettow-Vorbeck. He is the, second guy from the right. This is immediately before the campaign starts. And these are some of the askaris that work with the Germans. They are remarkably fit. They are highly skilled. They are selected both for their discipline and their reliability. And the Germans and British both would go nowhere without the askaris. They were incapable. So, I mean, the askaris on both sides, British version and the German version, are actually the most of the troops that fought in the war in Africa. The Germans are very proud of the German Schutztruppe, like Lettow-Vorbeck commands, are very proud of their service. They're proud of their Askaris. The Askaris are proud of what they're able to accomplish. Again, they are highly disciplined. And this is a map of this very complex war that's going to go on from 1914 to 1918. And the thing is, if you're a force and you're tiny, and the German force at the start of the campaign in August 1914 numbered about 2,500 soldiers. The Great Britain and the Commonwealth and the Dominions and its allies can field armies in the millions. So if you're 2,500 versus millions, or a million, or hell, if you're 2,500 versus, 5,000, I mean, exactly how is it you're supposed to conduct a campaign and stay alive and achieve something that's helpful to the war effort when you can't possibly win? And it's a question that he asks again and again and again as the campaign goes on. And with this tiny force, what he eventually decides, even though he fights the first battle really in September 1914, the most famous early action that he's involved with is a battle at a place called Tanga, where the British attempt to land an amphibious force and attempt to take the town. And because Vorbeck is local and he knows the area and he's on the spot, and the British are trying to put troops in places where they don't know the land very well, he delivers a stinging blow and wins the battle, and the British have to retreat to the ships. But it's not going to be enough. One of the cool stories about the German East Africa campaign involves this ship. She's called the SMS Coningsburgh. She's a light cruiser. She used to be on the Kaiser station in the North Sea, but shortly before the war, she's detached to the East Indian Ocean. And she's weirdly in the same position that Lettow-Vorbeck is in, because a single light cruiser of His Majesty's Imperial German Navy can't really do a whole lot against the mass of the Royal Navy. But what she can do, and does, she almost turns into a raider. And the captain is very aggressive here, and he manages to sink some ships, including a British cruiser. And he comes up with the idea that maybe we can prolong the life of the Königsberg by acting like a spider. And what he decides to do is he takes her to an anchorage that he has up the Rufiji River, and the British can't find her, and he will periodically pop out of his spider hole and hit something and then come back to the Rufiji River. The problem, if you're the Königsberg, and then with other things with Lettow-Vorbeck, is these ships are running on coal. So unless you can capture a coal ship, which they do a couple of times, the problem is the Königsberg, by time, is going to run out of power. And that's sort of what happens in 1915. But essentially, for about 9 months, this ship is on the loose, and the Royal Navy has to keep bringing more and more ships to the East Indian Ocean to try to find the Königsberg, and they can't. They do eventually capture another German ship that has a logbook, and the logbook says they've made a supply delivery to the Rufiji River. So the British go in search of it. They actually use an early a biplane to try to fly over the area, and the Königsberg is remarkably camouflaged. It's eventually spotted, but the British have one hell of a time trying to get up the Rufiji to get to where the Königsberg is. And she defends herself well. The Königsberg is eventually taken out of action, but in an incident that sort of capsulizes what Lettow-Vorbeck does with the campaign, is just because the ship's out of action and can't sail again, it doesn't mean it's finished being helpful. What the German crews do, first of all the sailors become infantry. That probably wasn't in their contract as they understood that. But they also dismount all of the guns on the Königsberg, and they make artillery, carriages for them, and they become ground artillery. One of the things the Germans are remarkably good at is taking a nothing situation and trying to figure out how best we can turn this into something that we can use. So that's the Königsberg after the attack. She sits, actually the part of it is still there, you know, if you're really so inclined, you can go down and do a little bit of shallow diving, and part of the hulk is still there. And that's the Königsberg's gun on a made artillery platform. There's another thing that goes on with the Germans, and because it's apparent that after the start of the war, except in a couple of, I think, 2 rare occasions, no help is coming to German East Africa. There are no German reinforcements, there's no German supplies, there's no German ammunition, there's not mail coming. You're cut off essentially from any base in a city or a town, at least within range of the British forces. But there is something the Germans try to do kind of late in the campaign, and this is in 1917. They decide to send an unusual care package to the German East African Schutztruppe in the form of an airship. She's called the L-59. She's based out of a German forward base in Bulgaria. And the L-59 is unlike any German, she's an R-class airship, is unlike any other German airship that was constructed during the war, and she's specifically designed to be cannibalized so that every piece of this airship can be converted into something useful for the Schutztruppe. Her canvas is special. It can be converted into tents. It can be converted into clothing. It has interoperable controls that can be used both on the ground as well as to drive the airship. And she has to make an incredible solo trip from Bulgaria to where they think Lettow-Vorbeck is in Africa. And the problem is they're not really sure where he is in Africa. He's somewhere in East Africa, go find him, is not really, you know, if you've ever done land navigation, that's really not something that you probably want to get involved in. And actually about half of the way to the destination in 1917, that's kind of a schematic of the L-59, she is recalled. And there's a dispute about what caused the L-59 to turn back, and she does make it back to Bulgaria. Because there's kind of a jester in this story of the German East Africa campaign and Lettow-Vorbeck in particular. There's a British officer called Richard Meinerzhagen, and he writes a book after the war, and he constantly, if you read the literature around the East Africa campaign, he finds ways to insert himself in the narrative. So he'll say, for example, that he was the one that sent the fake radio message to the L-59 and the reason the L-59 turned around. He says that he is the one who's cleverly left, you know, misleading instructions in a backpack that the British captured, so the, you know, or so that the Germans captured in Turkey, so that they would think the wrong thing, that he had fooled the Germans. And he shows up about 3 more times in the life of Lettow-Vorbeck. The problem with Richard Meinerzhagen is that even though you cannot go to a site, especially in the internet, and read about this story without something that he said showing up, he is a serial liar who most authorities have concluded murdered his wife to keep her from exposing his fraud. He went so far as to steal for Burr. He posed as one of the primary ornithologists on the planet, and they discovered after his death that in fact what he was doing was going to museums and stealing specimens and then pretending to present them to the museum as his new discovery. I mean, he's got his, we could have a Richard Meinerzhagen day if you want, I mean, because there's plenty of stuff to talk about with him. But so he inserts himself into the L-59 story. Meanwhile, back in German East Africa, what Lettow-Vorbeck is doing with what starts out as 2,500 soldiers and about 16,000 askari is he realizes pretty quickly that the last thing that he can afford to do is have a pitched battle with British forces. So he doesn't. And where I talked about this economy of force operation, or the idea of sort of force having an outsized impact, is that it essentially leaves the initiative with him. So if you're the British commander in East Africa and you're trying to find Lettow-Vorbeck and this tiny force, and they're somewhere in the middle of East Africa, they're in the hills, they're not in the hills, they're at a railroad junction, they're tearing up railroad track, they're tearing up telephone lines, you don't have any idea where they are. You see them when they want you to see them, and then they're gone. So the British spend roughly 2 years sending out columns and columns and columns just to try to beat the bush to find Lettow-Vorbeck and pin him, and then try to get a converging force to try to destroy him, and they just can't seem to do it. He's too slippery. It's like trying to fight a ghost. And he does this again and again and again and again. He takes losses, and part of the problem with this sort of a strategy that he adopts is it's very much attritional warfare, and the secret with attritional warfare is the side that wins is the side that can usually replace its losses. It's long drawn out, it's never decisive, it's about resources in terms of personnel and equipment, and Lettow-Vorbeck has got limitations on both those things. He's not getting more people, he's not getting more supplies, so he has to make do with what he can capture or make, and he's able to use the resources from some of the pre-war German colonists. He creates new officers from people who have no military experience or they're retired. He has a laboratory that's mobile, that is up in the hills working on different cool ways you can create things like new medicines that they've never had before, because he's not getting any supplies from Germany. So by German guys conducting experiments using native barks and native grasses and native remedies with whatever supplies they can, he's able to keep enough of this force together for long enough for the next day. And the next day. And the question is, how long can he keep continuing to do this? So it is sort of a gradual downward scale in terms of what he's able to bring and for how long. These are Askari and German troops. This picture is taken during the war. Some more pictures of the Askaris. The image on the right there is a version of what I passed out to you, which is money that he issues. So when Lettow-Vorbeck needs to requisition supplies, he has essentially, and Dar es Salaam has already fallen, so he's issuing this banknote in the name of the German capital that's currently in British hands. It's like an IOU. And thank you for your supplies of food or cattle or whatever, and here's some German money to compensate you for this. You want to guess how well that worked out after the war? So when people come and they say, but I've got German money, and the German general said that you were going to honor it, no, but they made the attempt. So what's going on here, again, just strictly, and I'm not going to go over individual days or engagements, but to try to give you rather a sense of the scope of the thing, and then here in a minute I want to shift and talk about how the German East Africa campaign gets remembered, and we really don't talk about this enough. So, start of the war, actually at Tanga, 260 German soldiers and 1,400 Askari. That's the first action of the war. The total number of German forces in East Africa in 1914, 2,700 Germans and 1,500 Askari. In contrast, by the time the campaign is concluded, and there's a story about that I want to share with you also, Great Britain and Great Britain's allies, so Indian troops, South African troops, Rhodesian troops, Australian troops, 850,000 British soldiers and porters And without the porters, you don't go anywhere. The porters carry your stuff. So considering what the Germans had in theater and what the British brought to the theater or used in the theater, these numbers are absolutely insane. That 850,000 British forces cannot find and annihilate 2,700 Germans. And they can't. And the thing about the German East Africa campaign, and the reason Lettow-Vorbeck is both a legend at the time that he's doing this, because word gets out, and even back to Germany, because British newspapers start reporting the fact that why the hell can't our forces find this guy? He's a morale booster for the Germans at home in 1915, 16, 17, and 18, because even no matter how badly things are going on the Western Front, it's a good news day because Lettow-Vorbeck is still running around and tying the British down. And there's nothing that they can do about it. I mean, if they can't find the guy, they can't do anything about him, and Lettow-Vorbeck is very good about planting information that he wants the British to know. You know, have you seen the Germans? Yeah, they're going that way, and they're not. By the time the surrender happens, and again, 11th of November, you know, the 11th hour, 11th day, 1918, the German East Africa campaign doesn't end then. It ends days afterward, because the reason the campaign ends is because a British officer who this force has tracked the Germans through Rhodesia and into Zambia, comes up with a white flag and has a telegram, and the telegram says Imperial Germany surrendered, or excuse me, agreed to the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. And Vorbeck is still in the field. So he lasts longer than he and his force last longer than the war does. Their numbers are not the same. 115 Germans in uniform and 1,168 Askaris surrender. So the numbers are not going in a positive direction, but the fact is, okay, they're still around. And the British are having to use resources they cannot afford to use, meaning these are 850,000 soldiers that could have been used on the Western Front in the war. They can't. They're looking for the German guy. Total casualties of the campaign, military, 16,000 for the Germans and 60,000 for the Allies. Killed, wounded, missing. By far, the greatest killer on both sides was not bullet, but rather disease, and it was, in some cases, there was really nothing they can do about it. But there's a lot of unintended consequences to this campaign. One of them is that because of the armies on both sides, because there's nothing there pre-war to support military operations, survival depends on taking, requisitioning, everywhere you can take it, and the effect of including people. Okay, I need porters. Congratulations, you're now porters, and you're going to carry our stuff. Casualties are very high, but even further, you're taking people off land that you need for food, and in some cases, food can't be grown in places where there's active combat going on. Some of the numbers for German East Africa during the campaign run as high as 300,000 civilians that died, not from maltreatment, at least not direct maltreatment, but rather because they starved. Or people who are near starving are being attacked by diseases. But in many ways, when the campaign does end in November 1918, it's singular for a couple of different reasons. It's simply different than the Western Front. It's not this endless day in, day out slog that just seems like you're just feeding people into an abattoir. It's different, and in some ways it almost reminds me of the way that the air war is conducted, which is there is a healthy respect on both sides for the other side. The British speak nothing but highly of Lettow-Vorbeck and his Germans. The Germans speak nothing but highly of the British forces that are fighting them. Nobody's shooting prisoners. Nobody is rounding up civilians and killing them. It's the last gasp, if you like, for a kind of war that certainly isn't going to be practiced in World War II, but it lets the Germans and the British both leave the war feeling like they have clean hands. The locals who live in the area wouldn't agree, but the idea is in a purely military context, that's mostly what happened. You have a great deal of honor and respect on both sides. So Vorbeck is taken into captivity. He's treated extremely well. He eventually returns to Germany in March 1919. He is, even though the empire is gone, he has a singular distinction bestowed upon him by the Weimar government, which is he is awarded the Pour le Mérite medal that he was never able, they couldn't get it to him during the war. And he leads a parade in Berlin, and this is 1919 Berlin, and that's a really unsettled, Wild West kind of time and place. But people line both sides of the road to allow his horse and his honor guard to march through. And he stays in the army. He marries fairly quickly after the war a lady named Martha, and she's, I think, 18 years younger than he is. They have four children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. The 2 sons are later going to be killed in World War II, 1940 and 1941. His army time after the war is a little unsettled. He's involved in Hamburg it's hard to explain. There is communist factions and right-wing factions that are fighting in the streets, and he's involved in a military action against what are called the Spartacists. He's later involved in 1920 what's called the Kapp Putsch, which is an attempt to overthrow the Weimar government, and he kind of finds himself on the wrong side of that one. So his army career, rather than retires, it just stops. So this is General Lettow-Vorbeck with his wife. She dies in 1953, I think, so about 11 years before he does. And this is where the story, you know how you want stories to end? I mean, that there's a right ending to a story sometimes. In this case, the story would have been a perfect bookend had it ended in 1918. But it becomes more complicated when you're looking at the life of Lettow-Vorbeck after 1918 and after he leaves the army. In the late 1920s, he becomes involved with a group called the Deutsche National-Volkspartei. It's not the National Socialist Nazi Party, but it's a party that eventually allies itself with the Nazi Party. And part of the reason is, I mean, there's no indication that Lettow-Vorbeck was ever anti-Semitic or he subscribed to any of the sort of that part of the Nazis' creed. But the early parties, to include the Nazi Party as early as 1919, had made it one of the principles of their founding that we demand a return of the German colonies that were taken from us in 1918. So Cameroon and Togo and German Southwest Africa and German East Africa and the colony in China and the Marshall Islands and Samoa and all those places that used to be German, New Guinea used to be German, places that we used to have in the time of the Kaiser should come back to Germany as part of a fair settlement of the First World War. Another thing that the DNVP, the party he joined, wanted was a return of the Kaiser, or the imperial family. At this point, the Kaiser is in sort of forced retirement in the Netherlands. But one of the things the DNVP says is we should get the Kaiser back. And I think especially to people of Lettow-Vorbeck's generation who are still monarchists after the empire has collapsed, That sounds pretty attractive. We need the good old days back, and the good old days were when the Kaiser was here. And he's fought so long in the German colonies that I think that appealed to him. But the problem is that it's sort of like if you're picking from a buffet, and you like the salad, and you like the roast beef, but there's also stuff on the buffet that, I don't want any part of that. He and others like him, who otherwise had served, again, very distinguished military careers, ended up taking the whole buffet. And you get especially people during the Nazi period with the National Socialists that will tell you the same thing too. I liked what Hitler said about this thing and this thing, and we thought that stuff about the Jews was just a bunch of talk, that he was blustering. But you kind of think somebody of his sophistication, his service, would have been able to sort of sort that out from each other. So the DNVP, the party that he represented in the German parliament, the Reichstag, during the time he's there, it's already issuing things that you would hope, have given him pause, but they didn't seem to. Herrscher, our rulers, and it's a satire on blacks, Jews, communists, and it says essentially, if you want these to go away, vote the Deutsche National Volkspartei. Or the middle thing here, that's the party name, and the bottom, Ordnung, Recht, Freiheit, order, law, freedom, which they co-opted, again, I think to appeal probably to people just like Lettow-Vorbeck. And even though his interest in this seemed to have sort of waned by the mid-30s, there were other veterans of the German East Africa campaign who came home as heroes that didn't stop there. So in this case, this is a reunion, and they held these every year. These are German East Africa veterans or German Schutztruppe veterans with their their distinctive campaign hats, some of whom apparently haven't been doing physical training for a while, wearing Nazi armbands. Okay, they have been entirely co-opted. One of the books that I passed around to you earlier it's called the German Colonial Yearbook from 1938. And the two passages I marked on there, and it's a publication that's pretty clever in some ways, but it's designed to appeal to sort of that person who probably served or at least has nostalgia for that kind of service. The one page I'd marked on you shows a picture of Hitler with a tiny boy in a German East Africa campaign hat, and the caption on the bottom reads, we need colonies just as much as everybody else does. The second thing the publication goes on to, and if you read it, and it's really pretty tedious, so I read it on your behalf, is a picture of a young girl, and it says Moroccan bastard, and it's supposed to talk about the dangers of race mixing with colonial peoples and native peoples. And there's another part a little bit further on in there that says, well, if you remember the Hitler Youth and you really enjoyed this publication, you may want to consider buying the following other things, and they're absolutely just pure Nazi propaganda. So the Nazis are pretty skilled, at least in terms of changing the memory of German East Africa campaign, and especially service, in a way both to appeal to the veterans and to appeal to patriotic sentiment in Germany. But Lettow-Vorbeck never went to these destinations. He just goes silent after about 1935 or 1936. There's a story that he was offered the ambassadorship to England by Hitler. And the one story says that he told Hitler in very colorful language to shove it. There's no evidence that any of that ever happened. And the source for that story is, guess who? Richard Meinerzhagen. Yeah, the bird-stealing, wife-killing guy, that one. But among soldiers, especially ones that had had very distinguished service in the First World War, Lettow-Vorbeck is still an icon. He's still, in this picture, he is pictured with General von Kluge. He's still wearing the campaign hat and is poorly married. And it's these two old soldiers kind of getting together, but this is after, this would be after 1934 anyway, when the picture was taken. He has a nephew who serves in the SS. But I think one of the stories that doesn't get told and doesn't get appreciated now, and even when we use this as a teaching point, I think it's important to remember that even though Lettow-Vorbeck, he masterminded this campaign, and it's a remarkable, remarkable job of almost running an insurgency. The people that made the success possible are the ones that we talk least about, which are the Askari that lived in East Africa that were the ones that did the fighting, or at least most of the fighting. There's a story, this really did happen. Before his death in 1964, General Lettow-Vorbeck had pushed the German Bundestag to grant a pension to any Askari that had served with him in 1918. And that they played around with this forever, and eventually the same year he died in '64, the Bundestag passed the resolution granting the petition. And this story, I love the story, I don't believe it, but I really like it, so I'll tell it to you anyway, is that the German commissioners who went down there to administer the petition found about 350 Askari that had served Lettow-Vorbeck still alive, and they couldn't figure out how to determine who should get a petition and who shouldn't, who was actually an Askari and who was just pretending to be an Askari. And before he left German East Africa, he had given all of them a discharge certificate. And a lot of them just had, it's been, from 1918 to 1964, and a lot of them had lost the pieces of paper, and some of them had brought pieces of old uniforms to show they were still Askari. And the commissioners decided on a test with a broom, and if you could perform the German manual of arms, you were an Askari. So if you could do right shoulder arms and port arms, and you could still do this, you were an Askari. And the story says that all 350 of the people passed the test. And it's an awesome story. I think the odds of 350 people doing things, all of them, is 0. But it's a great story, and feel free to pass it on as authentic if you want. There are still places where you can go and see some of this. If you go to Bremen in North Germany, the left-hand picture there is a celebration where Lettow-Vorbeck is speaking to commemorate a monument to the soldiers, German soldiers who fought in German East Africa. So it's this gigantic elephant with the tusks and around, and it's really kind of a cool thing. I've seen it. The middle picture there is when it gets taken over by Hitler. And the very distinctive lettering that was used in the 1930s, and Hitler posts an honor guard in front of it because it's in Hitler's interest to co-opt this image of the Schutztruppe for his own. And the right-hand picture is now. The elephant is still there. He's kind of missing some of his stuff, but he's still around. He's still huge. It's still imposing. They took off the Nazi lettering, and you can kind of see it, and there's a little explanatory plaque that explains what it is and what it means. Just since we're talking about Bremen, I'm going to tell you a story that has nothing whatsoever to do with World War I or Lettow-Vorbeck. If you go to the Bremen City Hall, you can see this has to be like one of the coolest sculptures anywhere in the world. They're called the Four Musicians of Bremen. And it's a really old German children's story, and it says that there were these 4 animals, and they were afraid their owner had died, and they thought that the new owner was going to treat them badly, So they all decided, like good animals should, to go be musicians in the city of Bremen because they knew that in Bremen you were free. If you got to the city limits of Bremen, you had your freedom. So they all set off for Bremen, and along the way they get robbed, okay? So their stuff is taken from them, and later the four animals, working together, standing on each other's back, you know, they spot this cabin where the robbers are at, and they scare the robbers off, and they get their stuff back, but then the robbers' gang comes back in, except it's now dark, and the one robber reaches through the window, and he starts reaching around, and then he just yells and screams, and all the robbers run away, and he says, they ask him what was inside, and he says it was this horrible monster. And one of them, beat me with a bat, and that was the horse with the hoof. And one of them, stabbed me with a knife. And one of them yelled at, had this horrible scream. And then the other, it was the whole thing that the animals had conspired together to defeat the robbers, and that's why you have the four musicians who never actually made it to Bremen, but that's the way it goes. Moving on. After the war, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, it became very popular for German military barracks. There were a couple of these to name themselves after Lettow-Vorbeck. So in Hamburg, there was a Lettow-Vorbeck Kaserne, and these two massive statues were part of the Kaserne decoration, and they're still around. The Kaserne isn't in operation anymore, and there's a little park here, and you can still go see them, and you can kind of get the idea about the size of the person. They're pretty big. One of the things that Germany has had some difficulty trying to figure out how to think about this is how do you interpret the colonial experience where you've got whites ruling over countries, just in essentially the case with Germany and Britain and Belgium and France, where they just wanted resources, and in some cases, like with the Belgian Congo, where you're talking about millions of people that get killed. So there are some streets that used to be called Lettow-Vorbeckstrasse that are no longer called that, but a couple of them, they're around. And in this case, this one here, the street name stays, and the Germans have decided to put a little explanatory plaque on the bottom that's trying to reconcile those two stories. So on the one hand, you have this German who's doing extraordinary things during the First War, but it's a complicated relationship. There's also a dinosaur species that was named after Lettow-Vorbeck, Lettow-Vorbecki, And weirdly, I found out within the last year, somebody's put his family's silver service up for auction. Just keep watching eBay. And he died and is buried in Hamburg. And you can still go, if you're at the cemetery, you can still go see his gravestone. So that's the story of the Germans in East Africa, and I apologize for kind of the abbreviated narrative, but there's a lot going on here, and you can easily unpack this and talk about anything you want. You can talk about the efficiency of the campaign. You can talk about the honorable aspect to it. You can talk about the tragic aspect to it. You can talk about the colonial aspect to it. You can talk about the way that narrative and memory shifts over time. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's what happens. I mean, nobody, every generation gets to interpret different people and based on their own understanding, and that's always happened. I had absolutely no idea what the next generation of Lettow-Vorbeck's going to be. But those are mostly the facts of it, and you can interpret it however that you think best. So, how am I doing on time? I'm a horrible time manager. I would be more than happy to answer any questions you might have, but I have one caveat for you, which is if I don't know the answer, I'm just going to make something up, and that's... Yes, sir.
There are quite a few different ethnic groups in East Africa where
Yes,
certain certain ethnic groups more likely to support the Germans and other ethnic groups more likely to support the British?
Mostly in the case of the Askaris, they drew them from the people living around either Dar es Salaam or Tabora, or not Tabora, but Tonga. Sir.
In Southwest Africa, the Germans were pretty brutal.
Yes.
And you can't imagine that, well, partly you had more deserts there, so they had other issues that would make that different. But you can't imagine the populace would be very helpful if someone was trying to keep a column sort of hidden, winding all over the place. Did the Germans have a better relationship with the natives in East Africa than in Southwest Africa?
They really did, and I think part of the difference is in terms of both the population density is one thing. What the Germans wanted out of the colony was quite something else. In Southwest Africa, you have some mineral interests, but mostly it's a port. They weren't terribly invested into, I think, improving the colony or trying to make relationships with the natives. Where in East Africa, it's a lot more extensive. East Africa is the oldest of the colonies in Africa. They've been there the longest. In addition to places like Dar es Salaam and some other where you can still see German-style houses that date from then. There are other places in the country where they're like sort of small German communities, and I think that's their relation. Well, there was a rebellion in German East Africa also, called the Maji Rebellion in 1906, that didn't end well for the rebels. But I think overall, it was a much healthier, much more cooperative relationship, and it was just one of the reasons the governor didn't want the fighting to take place at all was he felt like all the progress that they'd made in terms of both infrastructure and in relationships would be lost if fighting came. And you could argue that, I suppose, either way. But it was, like I said, if you're going to fight a place and count on local support, I think to at least, even if they didn't actively help you, at least they weren't going to actively hurt you. East Africa was a good place for that. Sir. And by the way, Kikuyu and Watusi were both groups that had helped the Askari, or both formed the Askari.
The indigenous troops that the Germans used,
right.
Askari or whatever.
Askari.
Askari. Well, I'll get to that question, but were the Germans attacking the English or the British colonies to try to take territory, resources, and vice versa? And were there battles in Kenya? And were the indigenous tribes used as troops in Kenya?
The answer is both. Actually, not so much fighting in Kenya, because most of the German operations. If we go to the, so I can find the map for you. Mostly confined to East Africa, but like I said, toward the latter end of the war, they ended up they're raiding rail junctions and they're raiding supplies where they can get them. So as the war goes on, I think operations really kind of go to the south, and the British feel like they've already taken the major cities. What the British end up doing is something the British had done successfully against the Boers in that war, which is that their plan is to cut the Germans off from supplies and food. So you have like a blocking force, and as long as we don't let we can let the Germans do whatever the hell the Germans want to do over here, but they're not going to get to places where they can get supplies. Which so that's why we go into Zambia and Rhodesia, and actually they're in Portuguese territory, which they shouldn't have been in Portuguese territory, but that's where the food was. Sir. Well, that's a problem. They're essentially keeping the shells, and they're using essentially the German lab guys are creating cellulose for guns. So they're pulling things from all over the colony and bringing it to there, and then eventually they can't. So they're capturing British guns as they can, British field pieces as they can, but they're probably using the Koningsburgh guns for 4 months or 5 months until there's no more.
During the Second World War, what was Vorbeck doing? You said he had 2 sons that were killed in it.
Yes.
Was he conscripted to be a high officer in the Second World War? What
No,
was he doing?
he was he was born in 1870, so by 1940 he'd be 70 years old. He didn't have a position during World War II. He was, they brought him, well, that's not true either. Sort of yes, sort of no. I mean, he's back on the list, but he doesn't have a job. So I think, again, Hitler's move to try to co-opt what he can co-opt, but he didn't have any command. He had no command or any responsibilities whatsoever.
Did the British have any aircraft that they could use to try to find the Germans?
They did. Again, the first use of that was when they were looking for the Koningsberg. So they're launching aircraft. There's one guy, they ended up creating kind of an ad hoc seaplane, and they did try to use aerial reconnaissance, but it's brutal. Which again, if you don't have any bases, you don't really have any aerodromes. It's not a place where they thought about using aviation before, and even getting a plane to East Africa is not the easiest thing in the world. So they did, but it wasn't much, and it wasn't effective. And as far as I don't know of a single instance where there was a reconnaissance aircraft that spotted the Germans and anything came of it. Yes, sir.
My experience with the Tanzanian military is a little limited, but they're a fairly Anglified force nowadays. Is there any residue of the German tradition and this campaign within Tanzania today?
No, there's one monument, and I don't know, this probably had to be put up in the 20s, but it's like a little whitewashed monument with a couple of plaques on it, with an iron cross. In terms of institutionally, I don't think there's anything at all. But it's weird though, because occasionally you see things that where it has a German feel or a German there's a German something. For example, in fact, you can try this trick out today if you'd like. If you go by a liquor store when you leave here, which is not the worst idea in the world, okay? And you go to the beer section, you can buy something called Qingdao Beer, which is a Chinese import beer. It comes in a green bottle with a very colorful label. That brewery started under German colonial occupation in Qingdao, China, as a lager. And the Japanese and then the Chinese just took it over. So essentially you get a pretty much a pure German lager coming straight out of China thanks to the German Colonial Service. Sir.
So the Germans lost all these colonies, these islands after World War I. Who got them?
Britain, France, that was part of the things, the spoils that were divvied up at Versailles. They went under what was called the mandate system or the protectorate system. So in the case of, in the U.S., we actually got little bits and pieces too. Kwajalein Island used to be German. Samoa, again, used to be German. But for the most part, the British and the French and the Japanese. The first Japanese really overseas expansion was a result of taking German islands in the Pacific. So that's, we could deal with that whole thing like in the talk on the next war, but yeah. All right. Thank you for your courtesy and